Ministers have met in Paris ahead of the UN climate change talks. World leaders will gather with the aim of drastically cutting greenhouse gas emissions. For more on this, let's join Bob Ward. He's with the Grantham Research Institute on climate change and the environment in London. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. You've argued that a global strategy is what's needed to reverse climate change. Is COP21 the forum to meet that challenge?
I think COP21 will be a tipping point. Climate change is a global problem. It's caused by the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The extent of the impacts doesn't matter where the greenhouse gases are emitted, and it affects everyone. It affects the whole globe. So what will happen in Paris at the end of this month is all the countries will get together to try and reach a new agreement to try and keep levels of greenhouse gases to a limit in the atmosphere that will avoid global warming of more than 2 degrees, which scientists have said would be a dangerous limit to go beyond, would cause irreversible impacts such as rapid increases in sea level as the land-based ice sheets on Greenland and West Antarctica start to destabilize, other changes in extreme weather around the world, the kind of things that would be very difficult to cope with and that we wouldn't be able to stop once they start.
Right, and some argue 2 degrees is still too much, but we'll remember a great sense of optimism, though, after the Kyoto Climate Change Conference back in the 90s. Now, in hindsight, that really didn't lead to the kind of change necessary to combat global warming. Do you think it really is different this time in Paris?
Well, Kyoto was really the start of a process, and its first phase was moderately successful. The European countries all cut their emissions as agreed. Some countries, like the United States, backtracked on their commitments. But what is different this time is that ahead of the Paris summit, we've had more than 150 countries from around the world responsible for over 90% of global emissions, all making pledges to limit and cut emissions by 2030. Now, that action is not yet sufficient to put us on a track that would give us a reasonable chance of avoiding 2 degrees, but it's the start of a process, and I think we'll see a tipping point in Paris when countries will start to accelerate afterwards, partly because countries will understand that the action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions also have lots of other economic benefits. For instance, it will lead to a reduction in local air pollution, which is responsible for killing millions of people around the world every year. And an important step towards that is going to be in Antalya next week, when ministers or leaders of the G20 will gather to talk about fossil fuel subsidies, which is one of the biggest problems. The subsidization of fossil fuels is making it more difficult to tackle greenhouse gases, and they've already pledged to remove those subsidies, and we need to see that action accelerating.
Now, if this conference, COP21, doesn't deliver a solid, legally binding strategy, what happens next?
Well, it's already been agreed that the individual pledges made by countries to cut emissions themselves will not be legally binding. But what will be legally binding is the agreement. And that agreement will crucially include a commitment to return every 5 years and report on what efforts are being made, with the expectation that countries will ramp up ambition. What is on the table at the moment is not sufficient to give us a reasonable chance of avoiding 2 degrees, and countries recognize that they will have to do more, and they will come back every 5 years and report on it. So I think Paris should be regarded as the start, not the end of a process, the start of an acceleration of action to tackle climate change.
Okay, Bob Ward, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us from London. Well, the president of the University of Missouri in the United States, Tim Wolf, has resigned following protests